أحمد جادو. 53 سنة. بدأت مع كونغ فو سنة 85.
My name is Ahmed Gado. I'm 53 years old. I started practicing the sport of Kung Fu in the year 1985. I was coached by Dr. Yahya Fawzi, who got his Kung Fu teachings from China, the origin and the mother of the sport. I was also later coached by Ra'ed Ahmed Sha'ban, who is an icon in the sport in Egypt. We were a young generation back then, watching cinema, watching Hollywood movies, and watching Bruce Lee, and that made us want to imitate him and practice the type of sport and contact that Bruce Lee does. And we used to play together. We didn't know what that was. We didn't differentiate between karate or kung fu or other self-defense martial arts, but we just wanted to, imitate what Bruce Lee was doing. And back then, there was no official independent association for the sport in Egypt, but Kung Fu was affiliated to the Karate Association. As far as my championships as a player goes, I was crowned national champion in the very first national championship I took part in, and that was in the year 1989. I finished third in 1992 and came back and won the national championship again in the year 1994, and that was all in the 56 kilogram weight division. I also won many provincial championships stemming from the province of Giza and playing for the Giza club. I dominated the Giza provincial championship in the 80s and 90s as a player.
اللعبة بتاعتنا بتنقسم لقسمين.
Our sport Kung Fu is divided into two main segments. One is for show or a demonstration and has a lot of methods. There is the northern method, the southern method, the javelin method, the sword method, and others. Our sport is one of the rare self-defense sports that uses weapons, but it's not weapons for attack or combat. It's weapons in the demonstrative or showy part or segment of the sport. There's also the combat section of the sport, or the sanda, And that was my specialty when I used to be a member of Egypt's national team. And of course, you get points there, not for show or demonstration or elegance of your moves, but for the strikes and hits that you land against your opponent. You could, of course, win via a knockout, a technical knockout, or if you force your opponent out of the 8 by 8 meters mat for 2 times, and you get points according to the strikes or hits you execute, and according to the areas where you hit your opponent in. And you get maximum points when you hit your opponent in the stomach or in the chest, where, of course, each player must wear a protective equipment called the Ugo, and that counts for 2 points. So there are also points for landing your opponent to the ground. You could get 1 or 2 points according to the strength of the execution. There are also 3 points scores in our sport. You get 1 point for hitting your opponent in the face or in the legs or on their feet. But I have to note here that it is prohibited in the youth competitions to hit opponents in the face, and that, of course, all players practicing Kung Fu must wear protective equipment all across their body, especially to protect their head.
لازم يكون في مواصفات جسمانيه في اللاعب اللي هيلعب لعبه دفاع عن النفس بشكل عام.
Most important tournaments in our sport are the World Championship and the China Open. And I dare say that the China Open is even more competitive and stronger than a World Championship. China, the origin of the sport. That's globally. Nationally, of course, there is the national championship and the provincial championships. We sometimes have very strong competition in provincial championships, especially in the governorates of Cairo, Giza, and Alexandria, and they could be as strong as national championships. We have made progress here in Egypt in Kung Fu recently in men's and women's activities. I was part of the generation of the 80s and 90s, and when I speak about the 90s in Kung Fu in Egypt, I have to mention my dear friend and world champion Muhammad As-Sa'a. He was really an idol for me. There were, of course, also great champions across the 90s, including captains Rabi', Basil, Sharif, and Gamal Salah. They were all champions, but unfortunately, the media doesn't really highlight their achievements because the media here in Egypt focuses on solely one sport, and that is, of course, soccer or football. But individual sports really do not get their share of the spotlight, and I believe that this is something that has to change because it is more difficult to be successful in individual sports. The successful Kung Fu player must have special characteristics regarding his or her physique and, of course, the mentality and the psychological strength. Now, physically, you have to be strong, and that could come from genes or could come from practice, nutrition, and lifting weights and other methods. Psychologically, you have to be very strong mentally because in many occasions you are asked to defeat opponents that are larger in size, and I believe that braveness and courageousness are key in our sport, of course, without being reckless. You have to be brave and courageous, but without being reckless. Of course, both the males and females have their separate activities in the sport of Kung Fu. And here in Egypt, we are also advancing in girls and women's activities, especially recently. And we have girls that are very talented in the show or demonstrative part or section of Kung Fu and in the methods. And we also have some Sanda girls and women who are very successful, and especially those who come from rural areas and from villages. And I believe that this increases their chances of success, because usually living conditions in rural areas and villages are more difficult than those in cities. So this makes for an edge, by the way, and gives an advantage to those stemming from rural areas and villages. And of course, there are exceptions, because we do have champions as well who come from inside the city life. Of course, number one in our sport globally is China. The origin of the sport, there are many theories as to how the sport of Kung Fu originated. One of them is that the Chinese, because they were not as tall as their neighbors, especially the Russians, had to invent some sort of self-defense method to protect their trade centuries ago. And another theory is that it came from temples, especially the Shaolin temple, and there were masters who tried to, get a hint from animals on how they defend themselves, and so in this case, humans try to imitate animals, but there is no one definite theory in relation to the origin of the sport. But the one sure thing is that it came from China, and China is still the dominant power in the sport until today.
اهم الانديه طبعا اللي فيها نجاحات كبيره.
We have many successful clubs here in Egypt who practice Kung Fu and who have graduated many talented champions, including police clubs, military institution clubs. There is also a Zuhur club, and the Alexandria clubs in general are very successful in the sport. You will find in each and every governorate a club or two who has been successful in presenting talented Kung Fu players to the whole of Egypt. Now, my personal wish is to see Kung Fu having a bigger base in Egypt. It is an art, it is a noble art. We use scientific methods to prepare our players. We learned all of this from Bruce Lee. It's not a violent sport, by the way, I have to note, as many people think or cinema may have portrayed. It's a sport for all, for males and females, for young and old. And I have to remind you that part of Kung Fu depends on shows and demonstrations and methods. There is the Tai Chi method, which is very close to yoga practices. So this can be practiced by elder generations, and it is a very healthy way of, having a good lifestyle. So again, our sport, Kung Fu, this noble sport, is for all ages. It is for everybody to practice, males and females, younger and elder generations.